Every morning at exactly 6:30, Samuel Torres unlocked the heavy iron gates of Riverside High School. The metal hinges creaked the same way they had for the past 18 years, a sound that had become as familiar to him as his own breathing. At 62 years old, Samuel had seen thousands of students walk through those gates. He knew their faces, their names, and if you gave him a moment, he could probably tell you something special about each one of them. Most people didn't pay much attention to Samuel. He was just the gatekeeper, the man in the small booth by the entrance who waved at buses and checked visitor badges. Teachers rushed past him with their coffee cups and lesson plans. Students barely glanced his way as they hurried to class or gathered in groups near the entrance. To the world, Samuel was practically invisible, but that was fine with him. Being invisible meant people acted naturally around him, and Samuel had learned that watching people when they thought no one was looking told you everything you needed to know. Samuel had worked at Riverside High since it first opened. Back then, the building smelled like fresh paint and possibility. The principal at the time, old Mr. Henderson, had shaken Samuel's hand firmly and said, "You're not just opening gates, Samuel. You're welcoming our future." Samuel had never forgotten those words. Even now, all these years later, he treated every person who walked through those gates with quiet respect. But something had changed at Riverside High over the past few years. Samuel felt it in his bones the way you feel a storm coming before the first raindrop falls. The laughter in the hallways sounded different now, more forced, more aggressive. Students who once greeted him with genuine smiles now walked past with their heads down, earbuds in, lost in their own troubled worlds. The teachers looked exhausted, their shoulders hunched under invisible weights. The current principal, Mrs. Davidson, was a good woman. Samuel could see that. She arrived early and left late. Her office light often the last one burning in the building. She genuinely cared about the school, but the worry lines on her face had grown deeper with each passing month. Samuel had overheard enough conversations to know that Riverside High was in serious trouble. The test scores had been dropping for 3 straight years. The numbers were posted in the main office, and while Samuel wasn't supposed to pay attention to such things, he couldn't help but notice the red downward arrows on the charts. Parents complained at board meetings. The local newspaper had run an article with the headline, "Riverside High from Pride to Problem." That one had hurt. Samuel had kept a copy of the original article from 18 years ago that called the school a beacon of hope for the community. How things had changed. The discipline problems were getting worse too. Samuel saw it every day from his post at the gate. Arguments that would have once been settled with words now turned into pushing matches. Groups of students clustered together in hostile packs, eyeing other groups with suspicion and anger. The assistant principal, Mr. Reeves, spent half his day breaking up conflicts and the other half in meetings about breaking up conflicts. Just last week, Samuel had watched a young boy named Kevin sit on the bench near the entrance for 20 minutes, tears streaming down his face. No one stopped to ask if he was okay. Students walked past him like he was invisible, just like they walked past Samuel. Eventually, Kevin wiped his eyes with his sleeve and trudged into the building, his backpack hanging off one shoulder like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Samuel's heart had ached for that boy, but he stayed in his booth. Who was he to interfere? He was just the gatekeeper. Mrs. Davidson had tried everything to fix the school's problems. Samuel had seen the parade of consultants in expensive suits carrying leather briefcases. They'd observe classes, interview teachers, and then leave behind thick reports full of complicated words and colorful charts. The teachers would be required to attend professional development workshops, where they'd learn new teaching strategies with names like differentiated instruction and data-driven assessment. Samuel would watch them file into the library on early release days, their faces showing polite attention that barely masked their exhaustion. The faculty meetings had become longer and more frequent. Samuel could see the teachers through the cafeteria windows, sitting in rows while Mrs. Davidson clicked through PowerPoint presentations. Sometimes he'd see younger teachers with their heads in their hands, older teachers with their arms crossed, and Mrs. Davidson at the front of the room looking like she was trying to hold back the ocean with her bare hands. Money was tight too. The district had cut the budget, which meant fewer supplies, larger class sizes, and constant worry about which programs might be eliminated next. The art teacher, Mrs. Lopez, had started paying for supplies out of her own pocket. The athletic department had to hold fundraisers just to keep the teams running. Even the building itself was showing signs of neglect. Paint peeled in the hallways. One of the water fountains had been broken for 3 months. The grass in the courtyard had gone brown and patchy. Samuel noticed something else that no one else seemed to see. The students weren't just struggling academically. They were struggling with life. He'd overhear conversations while sitting in his booth. Kids talking about parents losing jobs, families being evicted, siblings getting into trouble. One girl told her friend she'd been working at a fast food place until midnight every night to help her mom pay rent. A boy mentioned his dad was sick, but they couldn't afford the medicine. These weren't just students who needed better teaching methods. These were young people carrying burdens that would break most adults. The school's response, though well-intentioned, seemed to miss the point entirely. More rules were created. Stricter hall passes, mandatory study sessions, zero-tolerance policies. Samuel understood the thinking behind it all, but he also saw that it wasn't working. You can't solve a problem if you don't understand what's really causing it. And from his view at the gate, Samuel could see that everyone was looking at symptoms while ignoring the disease. But Samuel kept these thoughts to himself. After all, he was just the gatekeeper. What did he know about education policy and school administration? He had never been to college, never attended a fancy workshop, never read those thick consultant reports. His job was to open the gates in the morning and lock them at night. His job was to be invisible. So he watched and he waited. And he worried about the school that had been his home for 18 years. The crisis that had been building at Riverside High for 3 years finally exploded on a cold Tuesday in November. Samuel had felt the tension in the air that morning when he opened the gates. Students had moved through the entrance with unusual energy. Clusters of them huddled together, whispering intensely. Something was coming. He could feel it. It happened during lunch period. Samuel heard the commotion before he saw anything. Shouting erupted from the cafeteria, followed by screams. Then came the sound that made his blood run cold. The crash of tables being overturned. The clatter of trays hitting the floor, and underneath it all, the unmistakable sounds of a fight. Samuel rushed toward the building despite his aging knees protesting with each step. By the time he reached the cafeteria doors, Mr. Reeves and 3 other teachers were already inside, trying to separate students who were swinging at each other in a chaos of anger and adrenaline. It wasn't just 2 kids fighting. It was groups. Nearly 20 students were involved, split along lines that Samuel recognized from his observations over the past months. 2 students ended up in the hospital with injuries. One had a broken nose. Another had been trampled in the chaos and suffered a concussion. The police were called. Parents arrived in a fury of panic and rage. The local news showed up with cameras, filming the police cars parked outside the school that had once been the pride of the community. By evening, the footage was everywhere. Social media exploded with opinions, accusations, and blame. The school board called an emergency meeting that very night. Samuel had gone home after the incident, his hands still shaking as he locked the gates. But he couldn't stop thinking about those students, about the fear and anger he'd seen on their young faces. It wasn't supposed to be like this. School was supposed to be safe. The next morning, the parking lot was filled with news vans. Reporters tried to interview students as they arrived. Parents formed groups outside the entrance, some demanding answers, others pulling their children out of school entirely. Samuel stood at his post, watching it all unfold, his heart heavy with sadness. This was his school, these were his kids, and everything was falling apart. Mrs. Davidson held an assembly that afternoon. Samuel could see into the gymnasium from one of the hallway windows. The principal stood at the podium, her voice strained as she addressed a restless crowd of students. She talked about consequences and behavior expectations and community values, but Samuel could see that her words weren't reaching them. The students sat with crossed arms and blank expressions, going through the motions of listening but not really hearing anything at all. The days following the cafeteria incident were dark ones for Riverside High. The superintendent, a stern woman named Dr. Patricia Holmes, came for an inspection. She walked through the hallways with a clipboard, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, her mouth set in a thin line of disappointment. Samuel had opened the gate for her that morning and seen the look in her eyes. It was the look of someone preparing to deliver bad news. 3 teachers resigned in the weeks after the fight. One of them was Miss Chen, a young English teacher who had only been at the school for 2 years. Samuel had watched her arrive each morning with enthusiasm, always greeting students warmly, always trying new ways to get them interested in reading. She'd been one of the good ones, the kind of teacher who really cared. But the incident had broken something in her. Samuel had overheard her conversation with Mrs. Davidson through the principal's open office window. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but sound carried in the quiet afternoon, and he'd been trimming the bushes nearby. Miss Chen's voice had cracked as she spoke about feeling helpless, about loving teaching but feeling like she was failing no matter how hard she tried. She talked about students who came to class hungry, distracted, angry at the world. She talked about pressure from administrators to raise test scores, while dealing with problems that had nothing to do with academics. She talked about going home every night feeling defeated. "I wanted to make a difference," Miss Chen had said, and Samuel could hear the tears in her voice. "But I can't fix problems that are so much bigger than lesson plans and homework assignments. I'm burning out, Mrs. Davidson. I'm only 26 years old, and I already feel like I have nothing left to give." Mrs. Davidson had tried to convince her to stay, but her own voice had sounded hollow, lacking conviction. How could she promise things would get better when she didn't believe it herself? The community's faith in the school continued to crumble. The PTA meeting the following week turned into a shouting match. Parents demanded to know why their children weren't safe, why test scores kept falling, why the school couldn't maintain basic order and discipline. Some parents blamed the teachers for being too soft. Others blamed the administration for being too strict. Everyone had opinions, but no one had solutions. Samuel attended that meeting, sitting quietly in the back row. He rarely came to such things, preferring to stay in his lane and do his job. But he'd felt compelled to be there, to witness what was happening to his school. He'd watched Mrs. Davidson at the front of the room, her face pale and drawn as she absorbed wave after wave of criticism and anger. She answered questions as best she could, promised to do better, outlined new security measures and discipline policies. But Samuel could see she was drowning. The worst news came exactly 3 weeks after the cafeteria incident. Dr. Holmes called another emergency meeting, this time just for the staff. Samuel wasn't technically required to attend, but Mrs. Davidson had personally asked him to be there. "You've been here since the beginning, Samuel," she'd said. "You should hear this too." The superintendent's message was blunt and devastating. Riverside High had one semester to turn things around. If academic performance didn't improve, if discipline issues continued, if parent satisfaction ratings remained low, the district would be forced to restructure the school. Restructuring was a polite word for gutting. It meant firing administrators, transferring teachers, possibly even closing the school and redistributing students to other facilities in the district. "I don't want to do this," Dr. Holmes had said, and for a moment her stern exterior cracked, showing genuine regret. "But the board is losing patience, the community is losing faith, and we have limited resources. We have to make hard choices. You have until the end of the spring semester to show significant improvement in every measurable area. That gives you roughly 4 months. I suggest you use them wisely." The staff filed out of that meeting in stunned silence. Samuel saw teachers he'd known for years walking to their cars with tears streaming down their faces. These were dedicated professionals who had given years of their lives to these students, and now they faced the possibility of losing their jobs through no fault of their own. Or maybe it was their fault. Nobody seemed to know anymore who or what to blame. Mrs. Davidson stayed behind in the meeting room. Through the window, Samuel watched her sit alone in the empty space, staring at nothing. The late afternoon sun slanted through the blinds, casting prison bar shadows across the floor. She looked defeated, utterly and completely defeated. The school limped through the remaining weeks before winter break. The hallways felt different now, charged with a desperate, anxious energy. Teachers taught with forced enthusiasm, knowing their jobs hung in the balance. Students sensed something was wrong, the way animals sense earthquakes before they happen. Rumors spread about the school closing. Some kids didn't seem to care. Others, the ones who actually loved Riverside despite everything, wore their worry openly. Samuel continued his routine, opening gates and greeting students, watching over his small corner of a world that seemed to be collapsing. He saw everything from his post. He saw the 7th grader who always arrived late because she had to drop her little brother off at elementary school first. He saw the senior who sat in his car for 10 minutes every morning, gathering courage to face another day. He saw the groups who still glared at each other with hostility, old wounds from the cafeteria, fights still raw and unhealed, and he saw Mrs. Davidson, arriving earlier and staying later, the light in her office burning long after everyone else had gone home. One evening, Samuel was doing his final rounds, checking that all the doors were locked before he closed the gate for the night. It was past 7 o'clock, dark and cold, and he'd assumed everyone had left. But as he passed the administrative wing, he saw light spilling from under Mrs. Davidson's door. He almost walked past. It wasn't his place to intrude. But then he heard something that made him stop. It was soft, almost inaudible, but unmistakable. Mrs. Davidson was crying, not just a few tears, but the kind of crying that comes from deep inside, from a place of profound despair and exhaustion. The kind of crying that happens when you've held everything together for so long that you finally break. Samuel stood in that dark hallway, his hand resting on the cool wall, listening to a good woman fall apart behind a closed door, and something inside him shifted. For 18 years he'd been content to be invisible, to observe without interfering, to stay in his lane. But maybe, just maybe, being invisible for so long meant he'd seen things that others had missed. Maybe the gatekeeper knew something that the administrators and consultants and experts had overlooked. He knocked gently on the door. The crying stopped abruptly. There was a long pause, then Mrs. Davidson's voice, rough and attempting steadiness. "Yes, who is it?" "It's Samuel, ma'am. I was locking up and saw your light. I thought you might like some tea." Samuel always kept a small electric kettle and some tea bags in his booth. It was a simple thing, but simple things often mattered most. Mrs. Davidson opened the door looking like a different person from the composed principal Samuel saw every morning. Her eyes were red and swollen, mascara smudged beneath them. Her hair, usually pulled back in a neat bun, had come loose. She tried to smile, tried to pull herself together, but gave up halfway through. Sometimes pretending takes more energy than a person has left. "Samuel," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," Samuel said gently. "But I'd like to, if that's all right with you." She stepped back and let him in. Her office was a mess, so different from its usual organized state. Papers covered every surface. Coffee cups sat forgotten on the windowsill. The plant in the corner looked like it hadn't been watered in weeks. On her computer screen, Samuel could see a spreadsheet full of red numbers and graphs pointing downward. He went back to his booth and returned 5 minutes later with 2 steaming cups of chamomile. "Hey." Mrs. Davidson had cleared a spot on her couch, moving aside a stack of reports. She accepted the tea with both hands like it was something precious and took a small sip. For a moment, they just sat there in silence. Sometimes silence is exactly what people need. "I'm sorry you saw me like that," Mrs. Davidson finally said, staring into her cup. "It's not very professional." "Being human isn't unprofessional," Samuel replied. "It's just being human." She looked at him then, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in all the years they'd worked in the same building. "I don't know what to do anymore, Samuel. I've tried everything. New curriculum, stricter discipline, teacher training, parent outreach programs. I've read every book, attended every conference, followed every expert's advice, and nothing works. The school is falling apart and I can't figure out how to fix it." Samuel set his cup down on the small table between them. He'd been thinking about this moment ever since he'd heard her crying, trying to find the right words. "May I ask you something, Mrs. Davidson?" "Of course. Have you ever wondered what I do all day?" "At the gate, I mean." She looked puzzled by the question. "You check in visitors, you open and close the gates, you help with traffic flow during drop-off and pickup." "I watch," Samuel interrupted gently. "That's what I really do, I watch. For 18 years I've stood at that gate and watched every single person who comes in and out of this school. And you know what I've learned? I've learned that sometimes the people who are closest to a problem can't see it clearly. They're too deep inside it. But someone like me, someone who sits on the edge, someone who everyone forgets is there, well, we see things differently." Mrs. Davidson leaned forward slightly. "What have you seen, Samuel?" He took a breath. This was it. He could stay silent and let her struggle alone, or he could speak up and risk overstepping his place. But those crying sounds from behind her door had made the choice for him. Some moments demand that you step out of the shadows. "I've seen that this school stopped being a community," Samuel said. "It became something else. A machine, maybe. A factory. Students come in one door. We process them for 7 hours and they leave out the other door. We measure them, test them, categorize them. But we don't see them." "Not really," he continued, his voice soft but steady. Every morning, hundreds of kids walk through my gate. I know things about them that their teachers don't know because I pay attention. I see Rita Martinez arrive every day at 7 sharp because she has to help her mother clean office buildings before school. She's not lazy when she falls asleep in class, she's exhausted. I see Tommy Chen sitting in his car every morning, and I know it's because his parents fight at home and the car is the only place he feels safe. I see Ashley Williams walking with her head down because kids make fun of her clothes, and she's ashamed that her family can't afford better. Mrs. Davidson's eyes were glistening with fresh tears, but she was listening intently. The cafeteria fight wasn't random, Samuel continued. Those groups had been forming for months. I watched it happen. Kids clustering together based on where they live, what they look like, who has money and who doesn't. They were dividing themselves because they felt divided by everything else in their lives. And nobody in this building noticed because everyone was too busy worrying about test scores and data and making sure the district didn't shut us down. But how could we have prevented it? Mrs. Davidson asked, and there was genuine pain in her question. How can teachers address all these outside problems when they're overwhelmed, just trying to teach? Samuel thought about this carefully. Do you remember when this school first opened? I was here on that very first day. Mr. Henderson, the first principal, he used to stand at the entrance every morning and greet students by name. He'd ask about their families, their hobbies, their pets. He knew them. And the teachers back then, they'd arrive early just to talk with students before class started. Not about homework, about life. The cafeteria ladies knew which kids couldn't afford lunch and made sure those kids ate anyway. No questions asked. The janitor, old George, he'd let troubled kids help him with tasks when they needed to cool down instead of sending them straight to the office. He paused, remembering. Back then we had fewer resources, older textbooks, no fancy technology. But we had something else. We had relationships. We had adults who made students feel like they mattered as human beings, not just as test scores. When a kid feels like someone cares about them, really cares, they'll walk through fire for that person. They'll try harder in class. They'll make better choices. They'll protect the school because the school protected them first. Mrs. Davidson was nodding slowly. We've lost that. Yes, Samuel said simply. You've lost that. The consultants can't fix it because you can't consult your way into caring about people. The new curricula won't fix it because the curriculum isn't the problem. Even better security and stricter rules won't fix it because you can't control people into feeling connected. You can only build connection through relationships. And relationships take time and attention that everyone's too busy to give anymore. But the district demands results, Mrs. Davidson said, and Samuel could hear the desperation in her voice. They want higher test scores, better discipline numbers, improved metrics. If I tell Dr. Holmes that the solution is just to be nicer to students, she'll think I've lost my mind. Samuel smiled sadly. It's not about being nicer. It's about being present. It's about seeing each student as a whole person. Not just a data point. You want to know why test scores are down? Because students who don't feel safe, who don't feel valued, who walk into school carrying the weight of their whole world on their shoulders, those students can't learn effectively. Their brains are in survival mode. No amount of test prep will reach a kid whose basic emotional needs aren't being met. He leaned forward, his voice gaining conviction. I've watched Kevin Robinson sit on that bench near my gate 3 times in the past month, crying. He's a good kid, smart kid. But his father left last year. His mother works 2 jobs, and he's basically raising his younger siblings. Every morning I see him try to pull himself together before walking into this building, where no one knows what he's dealing with. He's failing 2 classes not because he's not capable, but because he has no support at home and no connection at school. If just one teacher took the time to really see him, to ask what's going on, to help him feel less alone, that might change everything for him. Mrs. Davidson sat back, absorbing all of this. Samuel could see the wheels turning in her mind. She was a smart woman, a good administrator. She'd just gotten lost in the same system that was failing everyone else. There's a girl named Destiny Johnson, Samuel continued, encouraged by her attention. She's been getting into trouble a lot lately. Fighting, talking back to teachers, skipping class. The office sees her as a discipline problem. But I see something different. She arrives at school every day dressed perfectly, hair done, makeup just right. She's trying so hard to look like she has it together. And every day when she thinks no one's watching, I see her mask slip. She's scared and angry and hurt, and she's acting out because it's the only way she knows how to deal with whatever's happening in her life. I had no idea, Mrs. Davidson whispered. I know you didn't, Samuel said kindly. That's not a criticism. You can't know everything about every student. But the system you're working within doesn't even allow space for knowing. Teachers see 150 students a day. They're pressured to cover certain material, meet certain standards, document everything they do. Administrators are buried in meetings and paperwork and dealing with angry parents and district demands. Everyone's running so fast, just trying to keep up, that there's no time to actually connect with the young people who are supposed to be the whole point of all this. Mrs. Davidson set her tea down and covered her face with her hands. When she spoke, her voice was muffled. Even if you're right, Samuel, and I think you are, how do we fix it? The district isn't going to give us more time or fewer requirements. Parents still want high test scores. The board still wants data showing improvement. How do we change the culture of an entire school in 4 months while still meeting all these demands? Samuel was quiet for a moment. This was the hard part. Having insight into a problem was one thing. Solving it was another. I don't have all the answers, he admitted. But I know this. Change doesn't have to be complicated. Sometimes the most powerful things are the simplest. What if teachers started greeting students at the door before each class? What if every adult in this building committed to learning something personal about 5 students? What if we created spaces where students could talk about what's really going on in their lives? The faculty would resist, Mrs. Davidson said. But there was a hint of hope in her voice now. Some of them, anyway. They'll say we're going soft, that we need to focus on academics, that we don't have time for all this touchy-feely stuff. Then we help them understand that this isn't separate from academics, Samuel replied. This is the foundation that makes academics possible. A student who feels seen and valued and safe will perform better than a student who feels like just another face in the crowd. It's not about choosing between relationships and rigor. It's about understanding that you can't have real rigor without relationships first. The conversation in Mrs. Davidson's office lasted well past 8 o'clock that evening. By the time Samuel finally locked the gates, his heart felt lighter than it had in months. He'd said things he'd kept bottled up for years, and more importantly, Mrs. Davidson had really listened. But as he drove home through the quiet streets, doubt crept in. Would she actually do anything with what he'd shared? Or would Monday morning bring the same old patterns, the same rushing and testing and disconnection? He got his answer the next afternoon. Mrs. Davidson called him to her office, and this time her eyes were clear and focused. She'd been up half the night, she told him, thinking about everything he'd said. She'd made a decision. She wanted him to share his observations with the entire faculty. Me? Samuel had asked, genuinely shocked. Mrs. Davidson, I'm not a teacher. I'm not an education expert. I'm just the person who's been paying attention, she finished. Samuel, I've brought in consultants who have fancy degrees and impressive resumes, and none of them saw what you see every day. The faculty needs to hear this. Will you do it? Samuel had agreed, though his hands shook at the thought of speaking in front of all those educated professionals. The meeting was scheduled for the following Monday after school. Mrs. Davidson sent out an email to all staff marking it as mandatory, which immediately sparked curiosity and some grumbling. Another meeting? Really? Haven't they sat through enough meetings? Monday came too quickly. Samuel put on his best shirt, the blue one he usually saved for church, and tried to calm his nerves. He arrived at the school's library where the faculty had gathered. The room smelled like old books and fresh coffee. Teachers sat in clusters, some grading papers, others scrolling through their phones, a few chatting quietly. They all looked tired. It was only November, and they already had the worn-down look of people who'd run a marathon. Mrs. Davidson stood at the front of the room and called the meeting to order. I know you're all exhausted, she began. I know you've sat through countless meetings and professional development sessions. But today is different. Today we're going to hear from someone who has a unique perspective on our school. Samuel Torres has worked here since the day we opened. He's watched generations of students come through our gates, and he's noticed some things that I think we all need to hear. Samuel walked to the front of the room, feeling every eye on him. Some teachers looked curious. Others looked skeptical. He recognized Mr. Patterson, the math teacher, sitting with his arms crossed and an expression that clearly said, "Great, now we're taking advice from the gatekeeper." Samuel cleared his throat and began. He told them what he'd told Mrs. Davidson. He talked about the students he watched every day, the ones carrying invisible burdens, the ones desperate for someone to notice them. He mentioned Kevin and Destiny and Rita by name, painting pictures of their daily struggles that most of the faculty had never considered. "I'm not here to tell you how to teach," Samuel said, his voice growing steadier as he spoke. "You all know far more about education than I ever will, but I am here to tell you what I see. And what I see is students who are drowning, and they're drowning in plain sight. They walk past us every day and we're so focused on lesson plans and test scores that we don't see them waving for help." A hand went up. It was Miss Phillips, a young history teacher. "But Samuel, we have 150 students each. How are we supposed to form deep relationships with all of them when we barely have time to grade their work?" It was the question Samuel had been expecting. "You can't form deep relationships with everyone," he acknowledged. "But you can commit to really seeing a few students. And if every teacher in this building committed to really seeing just 5 students, truly getting to know them as people, we'd cover almost the entire school. 5 students. That's all. Learn their stories. Check in with them. Let them know someone notices whether they show up or not." "And how exactly does this improve test scores?" Mr. Patterson asked, his tone challenging. "Because the district doesn't care about feelings. They care about data." Samuel looked directly at him. "You're absolutely right. The district cares about data. So let me give you some data. Studies show that students who feel connected to at least one adult at school have better attendance, better grades, fewer discipline problems, and higher graduation rates. Connection isn't separate from achievement. Connection is what makes achievement possible." He hadn't actually read those studies himself, but Mrs. Davidson had looked them up after their conversation and shared them with him. The numbers were striking. The correlation between student-teacher relationships and academic success was undeniable. "I've been teaching for 20 years, said Mrs. Rodriguez, an English teacher with kind eyes, "and I've seen what you're talking about. My best students aren't always the smartest ones. They're the ones who feel safe in my classroom, who know I care about them as people. But the pressure to cover curriculum, to prepare for standardized tests, it's hard to find time for the relationship building." "What if the relationship building doesn't take extra time?" Samuel suggested. "What if it's just about how you use the time you already have? Greeting students at the door takes 2 minutes. Asking about their weekend costs nothing. Noticing when someone seems off and checking in privately, that's not time away from teaching. That's the foundation that makes teaching possible." The room had gone quiet. Teachers were actually listening now, some leaning forward, others nodding thoughtfully. Mrs. Davidson stepped forward and explained that she wanted to implement what she called the See Me initiative. It would start simple. Every teacher would commit to greeting students at the door. Every staff member would identify 5 students to intentionally connect with throughout the semester. They would create community circles once a week, where students could talk about what was really happening in their lives. "This isn't instead of academics," Mrs. Davidson emphasized. "This is the foundation for academics. We can't teach students who don't feel safe and seen. We've been trying to solve our problems with more rigor and more rules, and it hasn't worked. Maybe it's time to try something different." Mr. Patterson still looked skeptical, but he wasn't arguing anymore. Others were asking questions, some practical, some philosophical. How would community circles work? What if students didn't want to share? What about curriculum time? Mrs. Davidson fielded the questions patiently, and Samuel chimed in when he could offer insights from his observations. The meeting ended with cautious agreement. Not everyone was convinced, but enough teachers were willing to try. Mrs. Davidson asked Samuel if he'd be willing to lead a training session on what he called the art of seeing students. He'd laughed at first, thinking she was joking. But she was serious. Who better to teach people how to notice others than someone who'd been doing it for 18 years? Over the next 2 weeks, Samuel met with small groups of teachers during their planning periods. It felt strange at first, him standing in front of educators with college degrees trying to explain something that seemed so simple. But as he talked about what he looked for when observing students, body language patterns, changes in behavior, the teachers started to get it. He taught them about threshold moments, those brief seconds when a student first walks into a classroom. That's when you can see them most clearly, Samuel explained. Before they put on their mask, before they get distracted by friends or work. If you pay attention to how a student enters your room, you'll learn everything you need to know about how they're really doing. Mrs. Lopez, the art teacher, started implementing the door greeting immediately. She stood outside her classroom before each period, making eye contact with every student who entered, offering genuine smiles and brief personal comments. "Love your shoes, Danny. Hope your mom's feeling better, Rachel. You seem tired today, Chris. You okay?" Within a week, she reported back to Mrs. Davidson that the difference in her classroom was noticeable. Students were more engaged, more willing to take creative risks, more respectful of each other. One student, a boy who'd been failing her class, stayed after to tell her that she was the only teacher who ever really noticed him. He started turning in assignments. Other teachers began sharing similar stories. Mr. Patterson, the skeptical math teacher, reluctantly tried the 5-student commitment. He chose students who were struggling in his class and made a point to check in with them before or after each lesson. Within 3 weeks, 4 of those 5 students had improved their grades. The 5th, a girl named Monica, broke down crying one day when he asked how she was doing. She told him about her grandmother who'd raised her being in the hospital, about feeling alone and scared. Mr. Patterson connected her with the school counselor and arranged for her to get extensions on assignments. Her math grade was still low, but she was trying again. And more importantly, she wasn't drowning alone anymore. The community circles started slowly. Some classes embraced them, others struggled. But gradually something began to shift. Students who'd never spoken in class started sharing in circles. Walls between different social groups began to crack. Teachers learned things about their students that shocked them, situations they'd never imagined these young people were facing. Samuel continued his regular duties at the gate, but now teachers stopped to ask him questions about specific students they were worried about. He became an unofficial liaison, connecting dots between what he observed and what was happening in classrooms. The counseling office started checking in with him weekly to identify students who might need additional support. The change wasn't dramatic or sudden. There was no magical moment when everything fixed itself, but like ice slowly thawing in spring, the atmosphere at Riverside High began to warm. Students smiled more. The tension that had hung in the hallways started to dissipate. Discipline referrals decreased, not because of stricter rules, but because students were acting out less. Mrs. Davidson started joining Samuel at the gate some mornings, greeting students as they arrived. Other administrators followed suit. The message was clear. Every person entering this building matters. We see you. We're glad you're here. Not everyone bought in. Some teachers continued doing things the way they'd always done them, dismissing the See Me initiative as a waste of time. A few parents complained that too much class time was being spent on talking and not enough on academics. But the majority of the school community felt the shift and embraced it. By December, something remarkable happened. Kevin Robinson, the boy who'd been crying on the bench, joined the peer tutoring program. His English teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, had taken him under her wing, learned about his situation, and helped him see that his struggles at home didn't define his potential. She'd also connected his family with community resources. Kevin was still dealing with hard circumstances, but he wasn't dealing with them alone anymore. Destiny Johnson, the girl with the perfect appearance and the troubled behavior, started attending a support group for students dealing with family issues. Her math teacher had noticed her, really noticed her, and had taken the time to ask what was behind the anger. Turned out Destiny's older brother was in jail, and she was terrified of going down the same path. Having someone to talk to, someone who didn't judge her, made all the difference. The changes were real, but Samuel knew the real test was still coming. Test scores wouldn't change overnight. The district would still demand data. Dr. Holmes would still be watching. 4 months had seemed like plenty of time when this started, but already December was here. And January would bring the midpoint evaluation. January arrived cold and gray, bringing with it the midpoint evaluation that everyone at Riverside High had been dreading. Dr. Holmes returned with her clipboard and her stern expression, ready to measure whether the school had made sufficient progress. Mrs. Davidson had prepared reports showing the decrease in discipline referrals and the improvement in attendance rates, but she knew those wouldn't be enough. The superintendent wanted to see academic improvement, and test scores wouldn't be available until spring. Samuel watched Dr. Holmes arrive that morning, her car pulling into the reserved parking spot, her heels clicking across the pavement with military precision. He greeted her warmly as he greeted everyone, but she barely acknowledged him. To her, he was just part of the scenery, invisible and irrelevant. That was fine with Samuel. He'd been invisible for so long that it felt comfortable, like an old jacket. The superintendent spent 3 days at the school, observing classes, interviewing students, reviewing data. Samuel caught glimpses of her through windows and open doors, always writing notes, always frowning slightly. His heart ached for Mrs. Davidson, who followed Dr. Holmes around like a nervous shadow, trying to explain and justify and prove that things were improving. On the third day, Dr. Holmes called a meeting with Mrs. Davidson and the administrative team. Samuel wasn't invited, of course, but he saw them file into the conference room with faces that tried to hide their fear. He went about his duties, checking visitor badges and managing the gate, but his mind was in that conference room, hoping and praying that the progress they'd made would be enough. The meeting lasted 2 hours. When it finally ended, Samuel watched the administrators emerge looking shell-shocked. Mrs. Davidson's face was unreadable. Dr. Holmes left without speaking to anyone, her expression as stern as ever. Samuel's stomach twisted with worry. This didn't look good. That evening, Mrs. Davidson called an emergency faculty meeting. The teachers gathered in the library once again, their faces showing the same exhaustion and anxiety they'd worn back in November. Samuel stood in the back, unsure if he should even be there, but Mrs. Davidson had specifically asked him to come. The principal stood at the front of the room and took a deep breath. "I'm going to be honest with you all," she began, and Samuel could hear the tremor in her voice. "Dr. Holmes's evaluation was not what we hoped for. Our attendance is up and discipline referrals are down, which she acknowledged. But our academic data from the fall semester doesn't show enough improvement to satisfy the district's requirements." The room erupted in frustrated murmurs. Teachers threw up their hands. "We told you this wouldn't work fast enough," Mr. Patterson said, not even trying to hide his "I told you so" tone. "The district wants numbers, and feelings don't show up on spreadsheets." "Let me finish," Mrs. Davidson said, raising her voice slightly. "Dr. Holmes gave us an extension. She's willing to wait until the end-of-year assessments in April before making a final decision, but she made it clear that we need to show significant academic improvement, not just behavioral improvement. We have 3 more months. 3 months. It hung in the air like a deadline for execution. Some teachers looked defeated. Others looked angry. A few looked like they might cry. Samuel felt his own hope faltering. Had he been wrong? Had his insights about connection and relationships been nothing more than well-meaning nonsense that didn't address the real problems? But then Mrs. Rodriguez stood up. "With all due respect," she said, her voice steady and strong, "we're not giving up. I've seen real changes in my students. They're more engaged, more willing to try, more present in class. Yes, it takes time for that to translate into test scores, but it's happening. We just need to stay the course and trust the process." "Easy for you to say," another teacher muttered. "Your job isn't on the line." "All of our jobs are on the line," Mrs. Rodriguez shot back. "But more importantly, our students' futures are on the line. These kids need us to be strong right now, not to give up because the results aren't instant." Other teachers began to chime in, sharing their own observations of improvement. Mrs. Lopez talked about students who were attending class regularly for the first time all year. The PE teacher mentioned that playground conflicts had decreased dramatically. Even Mr. Patterson grudgingly admitted that his students seemed more focused and willing to ask questions. Samuel listened to them all, feeling a swell of emotion in his chest. These teachers, despite their exhaustion and fear, were still fighting for their students. They were still trying. Mrs. Davidson let them talk, let them encourage each other, and slowly the energy in the room shifted from despair to determination. "Samuel," Mrs. Davidson called out, gesturing for him to come forward. "Do you have anything to add?" He walked to the front reluctantly, feeling all those eyes on him again. "I'm not an educator," he began, his voice quiet but clear. "But I've learned something over the past few months. Change is slow. Real change, the kind that lasts, it doesn't happen overnight. We're trying to undo years of disconnection and hurt. We're trying to help students who've learned not to trust adults, not to believe in themselves, not to hope for better. That doesn't fix itself in a few months." He looked around the room, meeting eyes. "But I've also seen miracles. Small ones, but miracles nonetheless. I've seen Kevin Robinson smile. I've seen Destiny Johnson laugh with friends instead of fighting with them. I've seen Rita Martinez stay after school for tutoring because she finally believes she can succeed. These things matter. They might not show up on Dr. Holmes's spreadsheet yet, but they will. Good things take time to grow. The faculty meeting ended with renewed commitment. Teachers agreed to double down on their efforts, to continue building relationships while also focusing intensively on academics. Mrs. Davidson worked with department heads to identify struggling students and create intervention plans that combined academic support with emotional support. The counseling office expanded its hours. Tutoring programs were strengthened. Every available resource was mobilized. Samuel found his role expanding in ways he'd never imagined. Mrs. Davidson officially created a new position for him, community liaison. He would still manage the gate, but he'd also serve as a bridge between students, families, and school staff. His decades of observation and his genuine care for students made him perfect for the role. The school board approved a modest raise, which Samuel accepted with humble gratitude, though he told Mrs. Davidson he'd have done the work for free. January turned into February, and February into March. The weather slowly warmed, and so did the culture of Riverside High. The transformation wasn't complete. There were still problems, still conflicts, still students who struggled, but there was also hope. The hallways felt different. Laughter sounded more genuine. Teachers and students greeted each other by name. The cafeteria, scene of that terrible fight just months ago, became a place where different groups of students actually sat together sometimes, talking and joking across old dividing lines. Spring brought the standardized tests that would determine the school's fate. For a week, students sat in quiet classrooms filling in bubbles and writing essays, while teachers paced nervously and administrators held their breath. Then came the waiting. Test results took weeks to process, and every day without news felt like an eternity. Samuel continued his morning routine at the gate, greeting students and staff, watching the spring flowers bloom in the courtyard that he'd taken it upon himself to maintain. Students started helping him with the garden, volunteering their free periods to plant and weed. It became a small oasis, a physical representation of the growth happening throughout the school. In early April, Mrs. Davidson called Samuel to her office. Her face was unreadable and his heart sank. This was it. The test results must have come in and they must have been bad. He prepared himself to console her, to remind her that they'd done good work regardless of what the numbers said. But when he entered her office, he saw something unexpected. She was smiling. Not a small, polite smile, but a huge, genuine, almost disbelieving smile. In her hands was a printed report with official district letterhead.